Ready when you are.
So we're here today. First and foremost, thank you, Damian, for meeting with us. If you can tell us a little bit about what your ambitions are in this race, and just let everybody know what congressional district you're running for.
Yeah, thank you. Damian Lara, and of course I'm running for the first congressional district of New Mexico. That's central New Mexico, greater Albuquerque metropolitan area, most all of Bernalillo County, all of the East Mountains, all of Torrance County, southern part of Santa Fe County, and parts of Sandoval County as well. You know, my ambitions for this race is really to help people live better lives. I know we can do it. My mom brought me and my siblings here to New Mexico seeking a better life, and we found and lived the American dream thanks to the opportunities that a small community with a big heart gave us. And so I know firsthand that law can either be a barrier to success, or that it can create opportunities for people to live the American dream. And I have dedicated my entire public service career to the law and to changing the law so that it can create opportunities for people to break the cycle of poverty, to divert at-risk youth from a life of crime, and for people to live the American dream. So if nothing else, I want to elevate the level of discourse and to make sure that our community's voices are heard. So I thank you for taking the time, especially on a day like today. And you know, coming down the march and going over the bridge, a lot of symbolism, but also a lot of hope that we've come a long way and that we can continue to improve the lives of all of our communities.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I kind of wanted to start off a little bit on the lighter side, and if you can just tell us a little bit about your top 3 priorities.
So the economy for me, when I tell you that I'm fighting for a better economy, is because I know, you know, firsthand that a growing economy let my mom get a business license, start a small family-owned business, and that's how she provided for her family. And you know, just study after study shows that when the economy is doing good for hardworking families, crime rate goes down. When the economy is doing well for hardworking families, substance abuse and self-medication and addiction goes down. When the economy is doing well, then people have time to dedicate to their children to go to school and get a better education. My second priority is a school and improving school systems and achieving parity within school districts between charter schools and private schools so that we have better possibilities for all students. You know, as a product of free public education, I could have worked as hard as I've ever worked my entire life. From before the sun came up to well after it went down, working in the potato and onion fields in southeastern New Mexico. If it wasn't for public education, my educators who seeing a little bit of potential in me and taking a chance on me, I'd still be there. So that's a huge priority for me. And then of course, fixing and ensuring that we have benefits like universal health care for everyone, expanding labor protections for migrant workers, for people who work on commissions. Those are my 3 priorities. And embedded in that is also ensuring that we have a sustainable economy that addresses climate crisis that we have going on now.
Yeah. Thank you, and I'm really glad that you talked about climate. One of the questions that I had was environmental, and if you're elected to Congress, what steps do you think you can take to address the fracking issues that are going on here in New Mexico? I mean, we're fracking Chaco Canyon right now. They're trying to bring fracking into both Sandoval and Valencia County right now. You know, I feel like it's a dangerous time to be doing things like that, and I would like to know what you can do to help if you're elected to Congress.
Well, one of the first things that I want to do is tax policy and address our tax code. And we provide billions of dollars of subsidies and tax breaks to large oil and gas companies to extract out of the ground. I would completely eliminate those. If they still want to provide or receive subsidies at taxpayer expenses, then they need to use those subsidies to invest directly into renewable energies, to infrastructure, for example, not just the smart electrical grids, but for electric vehicle charging stations, for employee training programs, so that instead of having to climb a 100-foot wellhead, that particular employee can learn how to lay photovoltaic lines, become a line journeyman, and receive a sustainable long-term career that is applicable to just more than the extractive industries. So first and foremost, that's what we can do. You know, a lot of the Fortune 500 companies have already seen the writing on the wall. You know, that is not the way of the future. We are running out of these fossil fuels. Fracking just extended the end in the bell curve 15, 20 years, if that. Many companies are already investing in wind and in solar. We need to incentivize that rather than continued extractive industries and pulling these fossil fuels out of the ground.
And where do you think New Mexico stands with moving forward on that right now? Where do you think the most work needs to be done on those issues with moving us over to renewable energies?
Right, a lot of it is unfortunately at the state level. We have companies like BP who are investing heavily in wind in places like Texas, but don't do that here in New Mexico. That's not so much a federal issue as it is a state regulatory system. And that has to do a lot with the fact that this state depends so heavily on oil and gas industry and the protections on that. And unfortunately, we as human beings fall back on what is familiar to us, what we know, and have a fear of the unknown. And so it's easier to say, okay, we know how to drill, so fracking, we can do that as well as an industry, right? We may not know how to diversify as much into wind. We may not know how to diversify as much into solar or geothermal or any of the other hosts of renewable energies that we can use. And so that needs to be done. You know, one of my college professors in political science very quickly, and I took this to heart, is, you know, laws create habits. And even after that law is gone, if you don't replace it and institute it, those long-learned habits will stay with you.
So we have lots of work to do there, but I think that you can be an advocate if you were our congressman, correct, on helping to navigate and bring those ideas back to New Mexico, to our New Mexico leaders?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, New Mexico can be a leader in charging the renewable energy economy, right? Not only because we are strategically and geographically situated, we have the best solar, the best wind, you know, other than the Mojave Desert in Arizona, but there's no infrastructure there, right? We already have the infrastructure, we already have the solar, we already have the wind to do that. We can lead this country and the world in how we transition from fossil fuel energy economy to a solar economy, and that does take capacity building. That does take providing technical assistance, and I am fortunate enough to have worked in DC and worked not just on legislation, but on constituent services, working with executive departments and working with local governments as well. So I can transition those things on day one to build the capacity, not just from ensuring that the subsidies and the money gets there, but that we have the right fiscal agents who are willing to implement that here at the state and county and local levels as well.
And I want to, on that note, talk a little bit about water issues and your position, and what do you think you could do as our congressman to help with what's happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline, for example. You know, that those are things that for us are really, really important issues, and we would like to see those things that have been pushed forward and shoved down our throat reversed.
Right.
Do you feel like you would be able to position yourself to be able to combat those things?
Yes, yeah, definitely. You know, tax policy drives a whole lot of those issues as well. And when you're no longer subsidizing extractive industries to do that, then the incentive to provide pipelines goes away. And the second thing on water and natural resources, that is huge. I would like to leverage our national labs to focus more on a research and development mission, and including line item appropriations for an inland desalination plant, so that we can safely and environmentally friendly way tap brackish water aquifers that we're sitting on here in the entire state and around the world and around the country to do those things, not just on the coasts. We can use and extract that brackish water, treat the water, use the precious metals and the salts, and reduce the waste that is produced from those. Use solar energy to power that, provide long-term careers for the individuals that will be providing and managing the desalinization plant. But then we alleviate the surface water needs, allowing the environment time to heal itself for those freshwater aquifers to replenish, and still continue to have water for agriculture so that we can maintain that agricultural heritage that we have in the state, so that we can have smart, sustainable development, infill in our urban areas, and that we can have development in smart ways. Whether you like it or not, plants like Facebook are incredibly water intensive. The Intel plants here are incredibly water intensive. So something like that, thinking outside of the box, bringing an inland desalinization plant to do that and provide the water that we need for our environment and for our growth, is the things that I will do in Congress. And those are things that I can do on day one. I don't have to have seniority. I have to have the right policies, the right permit to bring in the power of the purse for line item appropriation just like that. Right off the bat, that's a $200 million investment in a desalinization plant that can kickstart our economy, but then will provide dividends to all of the 10 microeconomies that we have around the state to continue to work and build a better economy for really the people who are going to work hard and who are going to move forward on it.
And that was one of my questions as well, is who do you see yourself aligning with or reaching out to in Congress when you get there? Who do you plan to work with to help on these policies?
I'm going to work with everyone and anybody who's willing to help. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. The trick is knowing when that clock is right and taking advantage of that. Obviously, I'm going to align with various caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, our delegation, of course, and working with them. But really, having worked in DC before and having needed to negotiate and work with people, it is about more than just saying along political or ideological lines. It is what is in the best interest for our constituencies. So you know better than most people, the same policies that bring up hardworking families who are white Appalachians are the same policies that bring up brown Burqueños here in urban Albuquerque, right? As long as we remove the institutional racism that kept us back, the golden age of America in the 1940s and the 1950s, where we put the priorities of hardworking middle-class families first, we need to return to those policies and ensure that our communities heard, that our communities have representation there, and that we have completely removed the institutional racism that has been plaguing our communities for over centuries.
And I'm glad you brought up racism, because that's something that's really important about our primary topic of what we wanted to discuss today. Are you familiar with the federal sting that that Damon Martinez brought here a year and a half ago as U.S. Attorney? He brought 3 Black CIs and 2 Hispanic CIs, and he pointed them at the Black and brown community of Albuquerque, and manufactured crime, arresting 104 people, and most were Black and brown bodies. Can you tell me what you think about moves like that by the federal government?
It's incredibly shameful, and unfortunately it happens far too often, especially from people who are supposed to be representing us and a part of our community. I've seen it firsthand. Being an attorney, being the president of the New Mexico Hispanic Bar Association, I've dedicated my public service towards combating that. It is implicit bias. It is institutional racism. It is outward racism. It's shameful, and it's hateful that continues to happen. And that is long-standing of practices in policing and in prosecutors. I work here at the state level on the Prohibition of Profiling Practices Act with Representative Nate Cote, and I've seen that firsthand on how institutional racism, particularly in our criminal justice system, has filtered down over the ages. You know, Jim Crow laws are a prime example. That's how people were disenfranchised, by giving them and removing them the ability to vote, by creating felons instead of treating them. I've seen it in the minimum sentencing guidelines at the federal level for crimes. I've seen it in the disparities between convictions for powdered cocaine and crack cocaine, right? You know, everybody likes to talk about the opioid epidemic and how that's a public health crisis. What about the crack cocaine epidemic that we had? That was just as bad of a public health issue. But our federal government and our local and U.S. attorneys turned that into a crime issue. That is shameful and embarrassing, particularly for somebody who claims to be in our communities. And unfortunately, it is shameful that we do that. But those are the legacies of laws that have been instituted for a long time. And to redo that, what did it solve? Nothing. It didn't make a dent in our crime epidemic. It didn't make a dent in the drug epidemic. We need to treat those as what they are: public health issues, behavioral health issues, and deal with the root cause of the problem rather than trying to make 15-second or use this and use an office to gain publicity at the cost of the lives of our community. I've said this: immigrants are not bargaining chips. People of color are not bargaining chips. People who are down on their luck and poor in a lower socioeconomic class are not bargaining chips to be used for political gain. That is the most shameful thing about seeing people in positions of power abuse that for their own selfish interests, and it makes me sad.
Do you think that there's things you can do at the congressional level to help defund some of these programs? I mean, these CIs were paid $80,000 a year by our own federal government, right, to come in here and target our community and victimize people. Do you think that you would be in a position to be able to address those issues? Yeah,
I'm in a perfect position to do that because my specialty is tax, budget, and economic policies. And we really do need to, where our budget reflects and should reflect our priorities, and that's where I would be the most effective in changing the guidelines as well, in providing grant and block grants and funding so that we can have training on implicit bias for our judges, for our U.S. attorneys, for our police officers, and ensuring that the DOJ doesn't require and enforce unfunded mandates on local communities to enforce civil immigration laws, for example, or to do these types of things, but rather to take an approach on what's best practices. Philadelphia, in New York, in major cities across the United States, we've seen what best practices are on what is really policing. States like Texas, for example, have moved away from the stance of incarceration and decided to do treat. It's about being right on crime and not about trying to get publicity that you're tough on crime, because that's what the flavor of the day is. It's real practical solutions informed by research and policy to do those things. And I am in the best position to do that because I have both a very good understanding of the criminal justice system. I serve on the Bernalillo County Juvenile Justice Continuum Board, which is direct federal funding to our most at-risk communities to do diversion from the criminal justice system, to do prevention and interventions so that at-risk youth can be steered away from being institutionalized. I've known plenty of people that say, you know what, I got into the system, I went to a state federal penitentiary, and yeah, that is a state institution. And I received my master's in criminology because I became an expert in crime. I came out with the contacts, and because of the way that the laws are set up that disenfranchise my vote, that prevent me from getting jobs moving forward, I had no choice but to continue to be recidivism. That are the things that we need to change. An industry that makes money off of the number of inmates that they have in beds needs to change. Those are all, like you said, where our money comes from at the federal level and what we're doing to that. And I am in the best position to change those policies, to change the budgets so that we reflect where our priorities are. And for me, that is treating the root cause of why we have such high crime rates in the first place.
And that's another item that I have on my list. I'm glad you brought up prisons. So New Mexico is #1 for private prisons.
Yeah.
Number one out of all of the 50 states for having our inmates in private prisons. We're at about 53% of all of our inmates are in private institutions, where nationally other states are right around 8%. So it is a big business here in New Mexico, and federal funds keep flowing in. We just had the San Miguel issue that came up, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but the San Miguel County jail there was shut down because inmates were dying in 2016. And they actually closed it because of conditions. CCA was able to secure federal funds, a federal grant, or a federal, God, I lost my words. CCA was able to secure the monies to be able to come back in to San Miguel County, reopen that facility with no changes, the same staff and the same conditions. And right now they closed Torrance because they said they didn't have enough heads in their beds, right? All of those people were relocated to San Miguel under CCA all over again. Do you think that as our congressman, you can address some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, in particular, is not providing those federal fundings, providing and requiring more restrictive standards for inmates. You know, these, whether we like it or not, a person is not defined solely by the worst thing that they've ever done in their lives. And we need to look at that, and whether we like it or not, these individuals are still human beings and they have basic human rights, that we need to do that. And so improving the standards needs to be first and foremost before they receive those fundings. Unfortunately, like you said, it is a huge industry here, and far too often our elected officials, at the cost of human lives, put profits first before people, and want to have an industry continue to create jobs just to say that there are jobs. You know, the economy that I'm talking about requires equal pay for equal work, but more than jobs, it's sustainable, long-term, well-paying careers that we can have on into the future. And you saw that here. You know, companies don't care about creating jobs in Torrance County or creating jobs in they care about bottom dollars, what's in their bottom line, and putting profits before people. It's the same thing with oil and gas. It's the same thing with the NRA and gun manufacturers. That's what we need to move away from. You know, I've learned my lesson in Washington, D.C., that corporations will get away with as much as you let them. And so providing those restrictions, providing the requirements for high standards of care and facilities is what's required before you put money out into the table. And that's what I would do as a member of Congress.
Thank you. I want to talk also on that same line of militarized policing, but I imagine your stance is kind of the same. You know, we have the federal government supplying militarized equipment to local law enforcement agencies and then telling them that they're not at war with the community. Yeah. So I know President Obama took some steps towards helping to stop that path of these weapons coming into our communities. Do you think that you're going to be able to address that as well? Yeah, definitely. You know, like I said, the DOJ really should be focusing on best practices and what actually reduces crime in communities. We have models of that in Detroit and Philadelphia and a lot of countries, in a lot of communities, in a lot of cities that had high crime rates, and they did actual community policing. And that's more than just PR and showing up. It's actually how you train your police force, how you engage. They still have to be police officers, but it is not a paramilitarized defense mentality, right? You know, we have the sheriff's office who patrols the South Valley, Los Padillas, some of the roughest parts of our communities, and they do not have nearly the amount of officer-involved shootings or deaths that APD does. Why is that? It's not just the training, but it's the culture that is pervasive in that agency. So doing that, that's first and foremost to do that. The second thing is that once again, I know the difference between what should be legislated and what should be regulated. The type of armaments that come from the federal government, from our military to our local law enforcement as a civilian protection force should not be at the whim of the president. You know, they were great when we had an executive that was doing the right thing, but you never legislate based on the current president
or based on the current executive. You legislate on what is right, and you do not leave important decisions as far as the regulation of what comes down to civilian law enforcement agencies up to an executive agency. That should be a legislative issue, and I will do that. I will also fight to ensure and legislate things like a prohibition on profiling practices by federal, and if you want to receive federal grants for policing, then you abide by those same standards. And using the powers of the purse, you ensure that local law enforcement as well as federal agencies like the U.S. attorneys are not targeting our communities and are not using outdated racist profiling practices, whether it's the FBI, ATF, firearms, tobacco, alcohol. None of these agencies will be allowed to do that if I am able to pass a Prohibition on Profiling Practices Act, like I helped right here for the state of New Mexico. And I am the best person to do that because I already have a track record of doing that, not just as a staff attorney, but as a volunteer and president of the New Mexico Hispanic Bar, as a board member for the Bernalillo County Juvenile Justice Continuum Board. These are the issues that are already on my website that I've already have firsthand experience implementing and fighting for.
Excellent. And thank you for the work that you've done on that. We appreciate that. So just sort of to wind down, I mean, we did touch a little bit about President Trump. I think that's the first time I've said that since he's taken office. But I don't want to be offensive right now. So you know how I feel about him. I would like to know what you think you'll be able to do in Washington, D.C. to deal with some of the things that he is doing in our country, particularly even on DACA issues. On attacks on, the racist comments that have come out of his office. I could go on and on and on. But what do you think you could do to build power to combat what he's doing? Well,
I could vote to censure the president. I could vote to impeach the president. And I can bring my unique perspective and voice as a person of color, as an immigrant who came to this country, and provide that story. I've worked on these issues in Washington, D.C., and we see it now. There are people, even within the Republican Party, who feel embarrassed, who feel ashamed by what's going on right now, and being able to capitalize on that, and being able to negotiate and work with people to say, hey, look, we want a labor force that meets our economic needs, but we should also be prioritizing family unity. I hear people talking, oh, we're talking about illegal aliens. We're not. DACA people, we provided very stringent requirements for that executive order. Background checks, no criminal histories, paying your taxes, going forward. These people have done what has been required of them of the law. They're law abiding. They're doing their job. They're not illegal. They're complying with the laws. Same thing with the Salvadoranians, the Haitians, the Hondurans who are here on temporary protected status. They have been complying with everything that's been required of them. And to say almost 20 years later, say, oh, well, you know what? It was only supposed to be meant to be temporary. It's in the word, it's temporary. Yeah, and that's a term of art in the law, and illegal alien is a term of art in the law. But it doesn't accurately reflect that these people have made lives here, that they've had U.S. citizen children here, that they've paid their taxes. I lived through 9/11 in Washington, D.C. In the House office building where I was at, on the very top floor, I served for a member on the Joint Select Intelligence Committee, and so we were fortunate enough actually to receive a phone call ahead of time informing us that that next plane was either targeted for the White House or for the Capitol, and to evacuate. By that time, the other plane had already hit the Pentagon. I could see the smoke rising from the Pentagon, and I remember that we were so proud when we were able to rebuild the Pentagon. The labor force that rebuilt that Pentagon in record time and under budget was comprised completely of immigrants who were here on temporary protected status. And to now say, hey, you know what, it was temporary, we don't need you here anymore is a slap in the face, not only to them, but to everybody who says, we remember 9/11. You know, it's not just about the sacrifices and the deaths and the things that happened, but it was how we pulled together as a country, as a nation, and how we came together out of many to be one nation. That's what I remember. That's what I want to take forward with it. So if you're a hardworking, contributing member of society, then you come here, you should have the opportunity to live the American dream, or at the very least, live long enough to see your children achieve it.
And talking about immigrant status, can you tell me your position on the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Yes, definitely.
And let us, you know, I want to hear, you know, because a lot of people, when they talk about 9/11, you know, automatically it has ignited in our country, unfortunately, this dissent against the Muslim community. And you know, I think that it's really important that we have people who understand the depths of those issues.
Right.
And can you tell us about your position on
Yeah,
that?
it's a very complex issue heated by, you know, centuries of conflict, of mistrust, and we need to move forward. I know that the way to have long-term sustainable peace in the Middle East is to advocate for a two-state solution, and one that recognizes that sacrifices are going to have to be made on both sides of the issue. You know, Israel and Israelis need to understand that the occupied territories need to be up for debate and need to be discussed. That some of those territories in the West Bank and the Nile and even in Jerusalem need to be part of the negotiating table. And you know, Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority needs to recognize that they have to have both the political will and the ability to ensure that terrorism will not continue. And so we need to discuss all of those issues and all of the other underlying complex issues, you know, not just the two states that are in, but the surrounding nations, to recognize that Palestinians and a Palestinian state has just as much of a right to exist as a Israeli state does. And when both sides are able to come to those terms and then negotiate where those boundaries are going to be set and the occupied territories that need to be returned, then we can continue to move forward on a lasting peace settlement process.
And what do you think about American money going in the billions to support only the Israeli side?
Right. So that is also something that we need to ensure that we provide a fair, balanced approach. You know, we're not going to be taken seriously by one side or the other if we're continuously, you know, unobjectively supporting one side only.